trillion stimulus means for my business and my people. It's a stressful time. I imagine you wouldn't be attending this webinar if your business wasn't facing some sort of financial struggle. So I appreciate you being here with us as we navigate through coronavirus relief and hopefully start to see some light at the end of the tunnel. When it comes to the economic stimulus package, you've probably already done some reading about it, but there's a lot of fine print and a lot of things to be determined. So we brought on a public affairs expert to help unpack some of that. Our goal today is to talk about what we know, identify the things that we don't know, and help each of you start to form next steps based on what makes the most sense for you and your business. So again, I'd like to say thank you for being here. I don't expect you to leave the session today feeling quite as zen as the guy on the slide, but I do hope that by coming together, voicing concerns, sharing some insight, we can provide you with a place to pause, regroup, and prepare for whatever tomorrow brings. My name is Brianna Harper, and I'm your webinar host. I'm also your resource for any questions you have during the session, after the session. We've planned about 45 minutes of content for you today, and then after that, we're going to open it up to a Q&A. So I'd love to answer your questions, hear how you're navigating, so please chat in the question queue whenever something comes to mind. After the session, I'll send out today's slide deck and a link to the recording. If you have any questions that we don't get to today, or you think of new questions after the session is over, please reach out to me. You can email me at bharper@outmatch.com or find me at OutmatchHCM. So really quick, before we begin, I want to show you what's coming up in our Future of Work series. We actually started calling this the new Future of Work series because the future of work we were all planning for at the beginning of the year looks very different now than it did before. 2 weeks from today, we'll talk with leaders about how they're managing uncertainty in themselves and in their businesses, while also being the calm center for others. Then on May 13th, we'll begin looking at how to end furloughs and bring people back to work. Now, we don't know when the return to work is going to happen, but we do know that we need to plan for it. So we're going to talk to HR and business leaders about that. And finally, on May 27th, we'll talk with people who have been managing virtual teams for years, as well as people who are new to it, and we'll talk through some of those lessons learned from the past few months. So I hope to see all of you back for our upcoming sessions. One last thing, today's session is valid for 1 professional development credit for the SHRM CP or the SHRM SCP. So look for that activity ID from me at the end of the webinar. I'll just chat that in to everybody. I have 3 others on the webinar with me today, and you can see each of their smiling faces. Jason Ferrara will be moderating the discussion today with our guest, public affairs expert, Joe. Joe will help explain the stimulus package, what it is, how it came into being, what opportunities are available, and what some of the long-term implications might be. Then we have Robin on to help us look at the stimulus package through the lens of people management and HCM strategy. So I'd love to go around and have each of you introduce yourselves and let us know where you're working from today. Jason, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Brianna. And Joe and Robin, great to be with you today, and everybody else who's joined, thank you. So my name is Jason Ferrara. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Outmatch. That job is all things marketing, from communications and demand generation and branding and sales and client support, to also kind of a broader topic just around storytelling of where our clients are successful, storytelling like we're here today to talk about. Tell a little story about the stimulus package, tell a little story about how to navigate and potentially survive that. So that's my role, that's what I do, and I'll be moderating this conversation between Joe and Robin. I'm working from my home office today in Southlake, Texas. I've got it decked out as best of a sort of a portable radio studio as I can. So hopefully everybody can hear me loud and clear, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Jason. Joe, welcome on. Would you introduce yourself for us, please?
Sure. My name is Joe Kefauver, and I'm the managing partner of Align Public Strategies. We're a full-service public affairs firm, but really more focused on the entry-level employment model. So most of the work we do is in the restaurant, retail, hospitality, and travel space. And we have been supporting the industry for almost 15, 20 years now. I used to run the government affairs department at Darden Restaurants, and then went out to Bentonville, Arkansas to run and start the public affairs division out there. So I was working, really deep into the employment space, and very much as Jason knows, in the future of workspace.
Thank you, Joe. Glad to have you on. Robin, over to you.
Hi, I'm Robin Stenzel. I'm the Chief Solutions Officer at Outmatch. I have the privilege of getting to work with our go-to-market teams. So sales and marketing, get to work with Jason and Brianna on a regular basis. I work with our product team, just hung up with some cool things that they're working on and focused. And then our internal talent team. So how do we think about human capital and people and strategy as we grow the Outmatch business? My background is in HR, where I've spent most of it in large and small, privately held, publicly traded companies. Most recently, before joining Outmatch almost a year ago now, I was with a large manufacturing organization, but I spent time in retail, in the airline industry, kind of both industries that are being hit really hard right now, as well as some technology industries. And then I am here in Atlanta, Georgia, out of my home office, aka my basement, where I am working today. So excited to be here.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you to all of you who joined us on the call. I'm really excited about our conversation today. I'd like to get us started with just a quick poll so we can get a gauge for where everybody is at. I'm going to launch this quickly, and then if you guys could just put your answers in for me. All right, the poll is open, so if you just take a quick second, let us know how you're approaching the stimulus, and that'll help us understand how to target the information we're going to provide today. So I see some answers coming in. Right now I'm seeing that answer B is leading the way, provide an avenue for us to get grants and loans, and also quite a few answers for D, all of the above. So if you haven't put your answer in yet, go ahead and do that quickly and I will share the results. All right, now we should see that pop up on the screen. All right, so yeah, B is leading the way, provide an avenue for us to get grants and loans during crisis. That's probably, what we expect to see. Jason, anything surprising in these poll results?
No, I don't, excuse me, I don't think anything is surprising. I definitely think we can dig into all these between Joe and Robin. One of the things that we're here to do from a goal perspective in this webinar is to start with the most basic at the beginning, and have Joe kind of walk us through like, what's going on here? What is this? And then as we get a little bit more advanced through that conversation, have Robin and Joe talk about what this means for businesses. So I think we'll talk a little bit about grants and loans. I think we'll talk a little bit about the opportunity to save business. We'll talk a little bit about improving the lives of employees and what that really means. Some of it I'm sure is in the stimulus bill. Some of it I'm sure is in us and our ability to lead in this what is this time of crisis. So I don't see anything surprising. I think that I'm glad we've got Joe and Robin here because I think we can add some value to those expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great segue. So Jason, I'll hand it over to you and we can get going.
Excellent, thanks. So again, Joe and Robin, thanks for being here. I prepared some questions that I did send some of them to you so you could prepare. I just want to talk a little bit. I'd like to start with basics. I don't want to start too fundamental, but Joe, I think a couple things I'd love to start with. First of all, can you just tell everybody in the audience, like, what is government affairs? What is public affairs? You know, what is this job that you have, and why do you know some of the answers to the questions we're talking about?
So I help. Public affairs is basically all-encompassing term for everything happening outside the four walls of a given place of business, right? And so it has to deal with, opinion leaders, the press. It has to do with elected officials, community stakeholders, your brand value in the community, and so forth. So it's all those aspects of things outside the four walls of the establishment.
Great, thank you. And so I think, you know, what's important to me there is you can bring that view of what's going on outside the four walls. I know in my job right now, we're so focused on inside our four walls and those of our clients that other than what I get from, you know, Wall Street Journal online, I'm sort of missing the bigger picture out there. So I'm glad you've got that view for us. So I'd like to start with you just giving us the story of the stimulus. I call it the stimulus package. I don't even know if that's what people call it out in the world. So I guess, you know, what is the stimulus package really called? How should we talk about it? And just give us how did this develop? How does this come to be, a piece of legislation like this?
Sure. So, you know, it's a good segue in terms of the stimulus. This is not, you know, this particular bill is not designed to be a traditional stimulus bill in terms of jump-starting the economy or jump-starting some particular piece of the economy. This bill is very much a bill focused on the workforce itself. And so if you remember, this is the third, there's been three kind of coronavirus related pieces of legislation that have passed. The first one that passed about 3 weeks ago was very much focused on hospitals and equipment and testing. It was very much in terms of the healthcare infrastructure focused. The last two have been very much workforce focused. And the second bill had to do a lot of paid sick leave and other types of employee facing benefits. This third bill is, it's the CARES Act. It's the Corona Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And the relief is important because it's really meant to be short-term. A traditional stimulus package is meant to have long-term complications. This is a very short-term focused bill trying to get cash dollars in the hands of as many Americans as possible, as quickly as possible. And there are ways you can do it. You can do it through direct payments, which you see the Treasury doing. You can do it through unemployment insurance and leave policies, which is also happening. And you can do it through employers, which is the nature of this particular piece of legislation we're talking about. Employers are really the pass-through. They're a pass-through for this money to go through the employer to the employee. And try to encourage employers not to lay off workers and furlough workers. So it's really, you know, people are beginning to think over time this has been becoming some sort of a small business relief act. It really was not intended to do that. It was really intended to be very much individual and worker focused, whereas the employer, was very much the conduit of that. So it's focused on trying to get workers remain on the payroll for the next 4, 6, 8 weeks. The duration of the bill is 8 weeks. So it's very much a short-term relief bill.
And thank you for that. How does an 8-week piece of legislation, like who are the players in Congress and the presidential administration? Who are the players who are putting these things together, and does that play into any of the legislation that has come out?
Well, this is an extraordinary piece of legislation for a lot of reasons, and you just touched on it in a way. Imagine a scenario where the leaders of both congressional parties in the White House worked cooperatively in a spirit of relief to get together and do something quick and fast. It's like we're so not used to seeing that. We don't even know what we're looking at here. But this bill was literally put together in about 10 days time. And the rules and regulations after the bill was passed have all come out in about 10 days time. So you're talking about a massive $2.5 trillion piece of legislation that was hammered out in less than 2 weeks. Very bipartisan, very leadership driven. So it wasn't like there was a constituency group or one party kind of driving the action. It was very much, put together with the initial players were the president and the speaker, and they agreed in principle to a framework, and it was, given to the Senate at that point. And most of the deliberation you saw, even, just a 2 or 3 days worth, but the tweaks and the changes really happened during the Senate process. So it was very much bicameral, bipartisan, but just incredibly quick. And that's why you're seeing a lot of the challenges with how the different programs are being rolled out, just because of how fast it was all put together. They knew it wasn't going to be perfect. They knew there were going to be challenges. They knew they were going to have to fix it in the rulemaking process. But I got to tell you, I've been doing this a long time, and I've never seen something this big happen that fast.
Wow. Yeah, that's great to know. I mean, I know my view of the news is different than someone else's view of the news. So, you don't necessarily see or hear about the cooperation as much in kind of mainstream news media. So it's interesting to hear about that. And obviously it had to happen. If it happened that quickly, you obviously have some agreement. So you talked about overall points in the CARES Act, the 3 different pieces of legislation that were passed. Can you just high level outline some of those? You said this really isn't a small business, a piece of legislation for small businesses, a Small Business Rescue Act. What are like the headlines of these pieces of legislation?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest piece, there's a couple pieces. There's the loan program and the loan programs, existing loan programs that were enhanced and new loan programs are kind of the lion's share of what was happening in the bill. There was a bucket of additional unemployment, other types of worker-facing provisions. And then the third bucket was the part that was kind of business focused in terms of lots of changes to the tax laws in the names of credits or tax forgiveness, so that those dollars could ostensibly stay in a business. For proprietors that had cash flow issues and were trying to keep people on payroll, it didn't make sense to remit sales tax or payroll taxes out to the government and wait 3 or 4 months for them to return back to you. So they tweaked the tax laws so that the small business owner could keep as much of those dollars on hand, without remitting them. So those are kind of the 3 buckets. The loan programs, even in your poll that you did, your survey at the beginning of this, suggests that's kind of where the lion's share and the focus has been. The Payroll Protection Act and the emergency disaster loans, the EIDL program. Most of what you've heard about is the Paycheck Protection Act. Almost $2 trillion set aside for that. That is, frankly, they expect in the next couple days to be exhausted. So there's already good negotiations to add another couple $1 billion to that fund, because those initial dollars allocated are already depleted, and it just went live on April the 3rd. So we're talking within 10 days, about $2.5 billion have been claimed for this program. So
what agencies administer the parts of this program? I want to get back to the Payroll Protection Act in just a second, but who's administering these? The loans, the taxes, the payroll? Like, what are the agencies that we need to know about?
Sure. The Small Business Administration is administering most of the loans. Most of them are existing loans through the Small Business Administration. The Treasury Department is writing most of the rules. There are some Treasury loans in there for other entities, but for small business people, the Treasury is writing the rules and regulations around this. There is a significant play for the Federal Reserve. That you saw last week. The Federal Reserve allocated a big chunk of money directly to the banks and the lending institutions. So they're a player in this, and obviously the Labor Department is administering the paid leave and leave pieces of this. But by and large, for the audience's sake, most of this is coming out of the Small Business Administration.
And if we think back about our poll, this is to understand and hopefully have this piece of legislation be an avenue for grants and loans. and then you just said that the Payroll Protection Act is essentially exhausted. So, like, if I'm on this, if I'm listening to us have this conversation, I mean, what's left in it for me? You know, if that stuff's exhausted, what's next?
It's almost a certainty that they will come back with another infusion of cash into these programs. They're going to tighten up some of the rules and regulations around them. There's some talk about making it harder for some of the bigger players to get access. You know, it was always supposed to be targeted toward kind of smaller employers. And it's in the rulemaking process, it's gotten a little loose and a little confused. And so there are a lot more people in that pool than they kind of anticipated. So you're right. And you know, as I said earlier on the third package, how it was, you know, by Washington standards, very, very, very cooperative, very bipartisan. You are starting to see on these next couple of packages, new infusion of cash into the existing programs, and then kind of the COVID 4 and 5 bills that are being worked on that are much more true stimulus bills. You're already starting to see those partisan divides kind of starting to come up. So that's what's happening on this bill. This bill went for a vote. This added monies to the Paycheck Protection Program went before the Senate last week, and it failed. Again, kind of partisan squabbling. It potentially could come back up next Thursday. I suspect if it fails again, there'll be so much public pressure that they'll have to come to some agreement fairly quickly.
Yeah. This information is outstanding, and my favorite part of it is you are connecting the dots for me with literally things that I've read in the newspaper with with sort of how real people talk and think about this. So thanks for that. And Robin, I want to ask you a question in the context of what we've been talking about. So in your previous life on the human capital teams at multiple companies, you know, would you have been the person figuring out what does this all mean? What do I need to apply for, and who's the beneficiary of that? Was that one of your roles in this type of thing?
I think typically what you'd see, especially in larger organizations, it becomes a almost group effort. So if you think about it, I think there's the human side of this. What do our employees need? How are we going to help and support employees, and what does that look like? And I think certainly the CHROs, VPs of HR, those kinds of things are part of that conversation. I think that's working in connection with your finance department and your finance organization. Depending on your size, you may have engaged your government relations office, and what does that look like? And then again, I think some of this might also start to think about what is your strategic outlook and where are you headed? Because again, I think there are some implications as you think about decisions that you're making, as Joe mentioned, kind of trying the act is there to keep people employed. But what happens if you look at your business and say, I need to look very different? What does that look like? So you've got to have a strategic lens on it. So if you really think about it, it's a series of leaders coming together to kind of look at those different dimensions and decide what makes the most sense for your organization.
And Joe, in terms of Congress working on this type of legislation, where do the companies that would ultimately be the beneficiaries of this money, where does their voice come in terms of developing this kind of legislation? You know, Robin just talked about several different departments in an organization. Is there a table at which everybody sits to hash this out? How does that work?
In the last couple of weeks, Jason, there are multiple tables, to tell you the truth. One of the things that Robin mentioned was how different companies are strategically organize themselves. When it comes to these particular loans, this is not a direct answer to your question, Jason, but when it comes to these particular loans, many companies are saying, hey, there's so many stipulations, it's complicated, you know, the paybacks. Many companies are going out and just getting basically private loans called pipe loans. And so they're not participating in the government process at all. And so you're seeing that. So companies are, to Robin's point, companies are making not only decisions on how best to participate, maybe to not participate at all. And there are some companies that are just staying away from many types of dollars. These next couple of stimulus packages, you'll see a lot of companies doing exactly what Robin said, because if the traditional stimulus packages where the government's giving companies or industries, large sums of cash, they become basically a business. The government becomes a business partner with you, right? And there's line of sight into your books, and there's all types of sunshine laws and openness that comes with that. A lot of people don't want that, right? And so you're seeing that play out as well. So there's a lot of decisions to be made, but right now, yes, as in terms of what's become law so far, in each of these COVID bills, there's been a process to do what they call technical corrections, which means fix all the things they didn't get right the first time. So in the COVID 3 bill, they went back and tweaked a lot of stuff on paid leave and unemployment from the COVID 2 bill. The COVID 4 bill likewise will tweak a lot of things they didn't quite get right in COVID 3. And so there's a lot of stipulations about they want to add incentives for some of the lending institutions that participate. They want to change the criterion. There's a lot of small businesses banding together to lobby Congress to make it much more focused on the small guys. There's provisions in there that are being debated. A lot of insurance companies are not, there's a lot of squabbling about what insurance companies will cover and not cover during this particular time. And so there are already tons of tweaks and changes being lobbied by different trade associations and individual companies. And there are a lot of committees being set up. I know the president just yesterday began the process of setting up a kind of open up the economy committee, for lack of a better term. I can't remember what he's calling it. But some of the companies I worked with have been asked to participate on that. So there are all types of industry groups, ad hoc working groups that are lobbying and weighing in with their members of Congress or the administration on this. And particularly the Small Business Administration, the agencies have been very, Labor Department and Small Business Administration in particular, have been very open to feedback. I don't want to say criticism, because they know they didn't get 100% right. It was so fast and it was such an emergency status, but they've been very open to trying to figure out how to tweak it. And that's one reason you saw the Federal Reserve put that infusion of cash directly to the lending institutions, because small business people were having trouble accessing that paperwork process and so forth.
And all that and all those people, everything's supposed to be wound down in 8 weeks. That's the time frame.
This particular bill, but I suspect you'll see extensions in subsequent legislation that we're talking about now. I suspect you'll see extensions. I'm just telling you what the intent was, the original legislative intent.
Yeah, no, for sure, and that's great. That actually, what I really like about that is, hey, here's what we thought about it then. Here's what we have to do about it now, and I think it shows a maturity cycle around the thinking about not only the pandemic, but our response to that. So I think it's important to understand what the initial thought was.
I don't want to take up too much of the time, but I think what's important to a lot of people in the audience, one of the things they've really got to get right that they did not anticipate correctly is they thought lending institutions would be much more eager to participate than they have been. And some of the larger banks, we saw Bank of America get a lot of bad press, Wells Fargo. The larger banks aren't making any money. They're getting a small fee for processing the paperwork, but they're not going to make interest, like a normal bank does, right? They're just kind of a pass-through again. And then a lot of the smaller community banks didn't have pre-existing relationships with the Small Business Administration, so they had to play catch-up on that end. So we put this program, we turned the lights on, got access to this cash, but the actual lending infrastructure wasn't quite near where it needed to be in terms of the banks that are participating, community banks, and how that process works. So that's something they'll spend a lot of time focusing on now, trying to get that right.
So Robin, in the context of this, and I'm trying to narrow down some of the questions that I've written down as Joe's talking, because I feel like they're really big. I'm trying to be as definitive as possible, but this stimulus package, in your experience, opportunity for a company or too big of a challenge for a company to really get involved in? What would your opinion be there?
That's, I think that's a great question. I do think it is an opportunity for some organizations, right? I think to Joe's point, this is going to provide you funds that's going to allow you to keep hopefully employees employed, maybe not working as actively as they were, but keeping them employed. If you think about some businesses and you think to earlier this year, we were sitting here and the conversation was very different. How do I attract people to come and work at my business? And so I think kind of to the point of this is when all of this started and started to come into play, it was, this is a short-term thing. I need to make sure that I've got employees so that when I come out of this, again, I think what we thought then, coming out of this means it's going to be the same. And I want to make sure that I've got a workforce so that I'm enabled and really can start to go ahead and move forward. So I think, that was sort of where the opportunity came, and it was about keeping sort of operationally and employees, bridging the gap for businesses and particularly small businesses during this time. What we're seeing now, though, is that's I think I would say be cautious about the opportunity, because really what you have to look at now is, will your business be the same? And from that could be anything from the size of your business. Does that change? Does the strategy of your business? I did X before. I might do a little bit of X, but I might be doing Y. And so what does that strategy look like? And what do I need to sort of run that business in the new way? And I think that's sort of something that's very much like these packages is probably changing as we get more information. I think, we've started to look at information that is coming out of China, as they're a bit ahead of us and what's happening there. And some of the insights, I think from a marketing perspective, one of those was looking at restaurants as an example. Pre-crisis, there was a big surge in sort of looking and searches for restaurants. During the crisis, there was a lot of looking and searching for delivery of food during that. And then what China saw is a kind of post, again, not that they're out of the woods necessarily, but kind of where they are in sort of their curve, they've started to see a drop off in both of those things. So now is it the fact that it's kind of a new normal that people are cooking at home? Well, what does that mean from your employee perspective? Well, if I'm now a restaurant, I may need to operate differently. I may not go back to business the way it was. It may be some version of that along with a delivery or takeout, but maybe now I'm going to stick to this longer term strategy of home components and, really kind of meal kits and things like that. And so that starts to look different. That means that my employee population needs to look different. So what I'm doing with this stimulus is this desire to hang on to employees. What you have to ask yourself is, do I have the right employees with the right skills to really be able to go execute what that looks like going forward? I don't know that we totally know all the answers to that, but it's just the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about and making sure we're making the right decisions for our business and for our employees. I mean, certainly I think kind of as companies, the opportunity and the thing from an HR perspective that really what it does for us is it looks at a way for us to help provide, care for our employees. It's the well-being of our employees. That's sort of our most important focus right now. Some of these other things, those start to come in, kind of become more long-term as we think about it.
Great. I have a bunch of things to unpack from what you just said there. So thank you for that. Definitely human capital strategy I want to unpack there, because it's so, hopefully it is so tightly related to business strategy. But before that, I want to touch a little bit about different sizes of businesses, right? So if I'm a really, really large business, is this affecting me differently than it is if I'm a smaller business, or does it depend on the industry? If I'm a huge restaurant, am I at do I have the same issues that a small restaurant does? Just because I know our audience sort of varies in company sizes. How do you think about that, and what's kind of your point of view on company size, where the stimulus package is available for companies?
I think a lot of it's going to be sort of industry focused at this time, right? If you think about it, because, let's take a look at the airlines as an example, right? Really large businesses who are just bleeding money every single day. I was reading this morning in the Atlanta Business Chronicle, Delta's getting some money from the CARE package in return for 1% of kind of share stock, share or stocks in their business, right? So they're seeing that very differently. On the different side, again, if you think about just sort of size, I don't think size matters. Big businesses like grocery stores and things like that, we're seeing that they can't hire people fast enough because they've got to worry about kind of two things. They've got to worry about, do I have my stores stocked? Do I have people who can help them? And oh, by the way, all these employees are now working on the front line, so I've got to think about care and the health of those employees, and how do I maintain that? Might I be having more sick time? All of those things that the package has in there. So I don't think it's so much size of business, and again, I think you can take that down to maybe a local grocer who's smaller, maybe certainly just kind of in the supply chain of getting things quickly might be a little bit harder. But if you think about in the restaurant industry as an example, whether I'm a small restaurant or a large restaurant, the difference is kind of might be sort of what did my P&L look like before. So how fast does this impact me might be a difference in some of those things.
Robin, where should I start? If I'm of any size company, if I'm the CHRO, or anybody for that matter in a business, where do I start? I mean, Joe has talked about a lot of different pieces of legislation. You've brought up a lot of different ideas around human capital strategy. If I sit back, I clear off my desk, like, where do I start?
I think, you start with sort of what's in front of me and what do I know right now? So what is happening to my business, and what are the things that I need to do to maintain that business so that I have a business coming out of it? What are the drivers to kind of come out of that? Now, I think you layer into that, what is coming out of that mean, and what does that look like, and what does that look like from a strategic perspective, and how do I start to make choices that will help align, where I'm headed more quickly down the road. So again, if my business is going to look different, I'm going to want to make some shifts and changes probably earlier on. And I think, as Joe talked about, some of this money that comes in and it's got all these stipulations on it, you can't be letting those stipulations run your business, or you're going to come out of this and not have a business because it's not going to look the same. But again, I think kind of first and foremost, you're looking at what are those things that are happening, and how do I keep my business going, and how do I keep the well-being of my employees focused from that perspective, right? So I think, again, there's sort of this, and those things can become challenging to balance, right? I'm looking at my business, things aren't going well. It's not, from a long-term perspective, I'm not sure where I'm headed, but I've got care and responsibility for a large group of people, and how do I balance those things? And you've got to kind of, again, really decide what are those decisions that you need to make along the way to help kind of, again, the longer term outcome, but with care and thoughtfulness towards the impact to people.
So Joe, I want to clarify a couple of things, because employee well-being has come up a couple of times, really important. There are many pieces, I think, of employee well-being. Obviously, somebody's pay is employee well-being, but so is somebody's physical health and people's mental health. So are there provisions in any of these pieces of legislation around that? How do we, the first thing that popped in my head is there more support for an employee assistance program? Right? How do we take care of the whole person as opposed to just, okay, we got a nut of salaries that we have to make sure we can pay?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really gotten too much. There are some provisions buried deep. The CARES Act is a 900-page bill. There are actually some tax changes to employee retraining and educational assistance. So those things are touched on in there, and there are changes in there to benefit retraining while people are furloughed, and can they continue to meet their continuing education credits? Is there funding for the 401k matches? There's types of language in there. Obviously not the focus of the bill, and subsequent pieces will have more on that. I think the important thing, and I just want to play off of what Robin was saying, is that this is a really interesting time for a lot of businesses. On the one hand, you're wondering if you're going to be in business in a couple of months, and if you are, what does that look like? But in terms of a lot of these issues, future of work issues or employee benefit issues, this particular bill we knew all these trend lines were coming. We knew that there's an increasing reliance on independent contractors. We knew that we had a conversation looming in a lot of employee intensive industries on portable benefits and so forth. This crisis has sped up those conversations by 5 or 10 years. We're going to be having those conversations in the next 6 months, not 6 years from now. And what this bill did, one of the many things this bill did was treated independent contractors by and large as employees. It moved the ball tremendously down the field on that set of issues. It dramatically expanded paid sick leave provisions that the federal government had really never done before. You're seeing states going even further. And a lot of those genies are not going to go back in the bottle. So when you're an employer trying to figure out what your business model will look like, the other piece, obviously, most glaring, and Robin speaks to it, is important for a couple reasons. But this, it sped up our reliance on a delivery economy. For thousands of years, consumers have gone to a market or to a place of commerce. And in the last 10 or 15 years, we've kind of reversed that. We expect it all to come to us. This has exponentially sped that up to a point where restaurants and convenience stores and a lot of retailers have automated themselves past the place that they'll never come back. And that takes a different type of employee. That takes a different, it's a very different looking P&L. It's a very different looking profitability margin relative to labor and the product. And a lot of those genies are not coming back. And so prior to this crisis, in the retail community, you think if you work for Walmart, you're competing against Target and Home Depot for employees. If you work for Olive Garden, you're competing against Buffalo Wild Wings or Outback for employees. All of these entry-level retailers are now, and again, it was already happening, but it's sped up exponentially, are now competing against the supply chain employee, whether it's groceries, whether it's Amazon distribution. Like I said, already happening, just sped it up incredibly. And they have very different wage and benefit platforms. They have very different relationship with benefits and independent contractor status. So it's going to be very interesting what the retail outlet, restaurant, convenience store, hotel of the future is going to look like. And to Robin's point, that's being decided now. I mean, that future is, and it was coming. Like I say, it was coming, and most companies were thinking through those. The companies that I work with were thinking through those processes. How do we position ourselves? But we're going to have to make some very quick decisions as industries and employers on all of these subjects: independent contractor, future of work, delivery platforms, portable benefits. All those things are on our doorstep now.
So Robin, go ahead.
To that point, right, as you think about that and you kind of think about your human capital strategy, right, that sort of expands. And we were starting to think about a little bit around gig workers and contract workers and those kinds of things, where we've always been in this sort of weird space that I think we have to do is how do we think about the engagement levels of those? Because those are going to directly reflect customer satisfaction. So to Joe's point, as you think about this and as you think about sort of this delivery model, and it's got kind of this new way of thinking, it's going to be important for me to now care about how engaged are my contract and or gig workers, and what does that look like? Because these are the people who are going to be showing up in front of my customers every day. Because again, when you show up and you get something, as we've been sitting here, my doorbell has rang and there is a delivery sitting on there from a large retailer, right, kind of thing. But if I had been there and answered the door, my experience now comes to, and it kind of goes back onto what is that retailer? I don't think, oh, that's just a temporary worker, or it's a worker from a different organization that's now doing it. I go back and think about that experience as being that retailer or that grocery store chain or wherever that is. And so again, as we think about HR and strategy and we start to talk about things that we've said are really important and that impact our bottom line, like engagement, how do I think about engagement in new ways that really starts to look beyond my current workforce? If I haven't already been doing that, how do I start to think about that?
I'm so glad you both touched on that, because we got 2 questions in about independent contractors. So I think that you guys did a really good job kind of covering what that looks like and how that might evolve. One of the questions I have here is, does this benefit self-employed business that does not have employees except for the owner as the only employee? So I just wanted to throw one of those questions out because I thought it was related to what we're talking about right now. If anybody else has additional questions, I've got a few here, but go ahead and get your questions in before we move to the Q&A so we can be ready to answer you guys. Joe, do you want to add anything to, we talked about small businesses, anything you want to add about self-employed businesses?
Yeah, I don't think it, it's going glaring, like if you're a one-person business, you work out of your home and you're a freelance CPA or whatever it might be. There's not a lot in here for you. Because you don't have a payroll, right? Except for yourself, obviously. Again, it's trying to benefit yes, it's designed for larger employees, but not intentionally. Just larger employees can touch more people, right? And if it's a conduit to more people. So it was kind of just inherently biased toward that. And so one of the pushbacks now is maybe we overcorrected, and maybe we got to figure out a way to tailor it more for those employers that are 15 and 20 and 25 and figure out. And there are a number of bipartisan group of senators that has kind of taken up that cause as well. So like I say, I think if you're just a sole proprietor, 1099, you're a contractor, this bill did not do very much for you.
Got it. And Robin, you had talked about, Joe had talked about delivery model. Absolutely. I mean, my doorbell's ringing off the hook too. Just other than yeast, I can pretty much get everything I need. Yeast seems to be totally out of stock every place I look. So delivery model and engagement levels, you went through, like, here are the things I need to think about today. What's like the first thing you would do, after this webinar, we hang up, what's the first thing you would recommend somebody do as they look to navigate what all this means in their business and how their business is changing?
I mean, I think regardless of any of these things, right, the first thing and probably the most important thing from an HR perspective that you should, hopefully you've been focused on and you continue to focus on, is the well-being of your employees. Mm-hmm. Because I think that piece of it is going to be really important as you think about coming out of this, whether it's your consumers or the people who will come work for you. People are going to look at businesses and how did they react? How did they come out and how did they treat people during this time period? Right? That's going to help you gain employee and customer market share as you lead through that, because, again, that press, if it doesn't go, is not going to help you, and that word of mouth and social media and all of those things are really going to be challenging. So I'd say if you're not doing that today, you should certainly be doing that. I think most people, in almost every conversation I have, that sort of starts with, how are you doing? How are your employees? How are you taking care of your employees? So I'd say continue doing that. I think, the next thing you'd want to do kind of coming out of this webinar is really step back and think about, again, where are we today and what is the longer term? Where are we headed as a business, and where are we going? And are the decisions that we've made to date short-term or long-term decisions, and when do I need to start pulling the trigger to start to shift some of those things? So I think an example of that is, we've seen, I see over and over, sort of 6.6 million people collecting unemployment. We know that all those people are not unemployed. Some of those people are furloughed. Some of those people are on reduced hour schedules. They're in a variety of places. And so there's this idea of, if I've reduced schedules or pay or furloughed people, when am I going to start to bring that back? And we need to start thinking now about, what does that look like? And how do I start to shift and think about bringing people back into my business? And what do I need to know to bring them in there? Well, I need to know the strategy. Where are we headed? I need to then understand what are the skills that I'm going to need to bring back into my business, and what does that look like? And I'm going to need to understand sort of the velocity or the revenue kind of standpoints of what that looks like as well, as I start to come in and start to bring through that. So I think from a kind of human capital standpoint is how do we start to think and plan and look and make decisions? Because if I look at my workforce and I've furloughed a lot of people, and my business is going to look different at some point, right? Furlough means I'm going to bring you back. When do I start to make those decisions of that's not going to work, or yes, I do need to bring you back, and in what order do I do that, and who do I bring back, and when, and all of those things. And if you haven't started that, I think at least starting that plan, knowing again that you're might have to shift and do some things differently, because again, I don't think we're at the end of this and we still don't know what we don't know. But how do I start to think about what does the new, my business look like kind of coming out of this, and how am I starting to do that? Because all of those things, as you shift in those plans, you're going to go need to work with your finance department and make sure that those two things are aligned. Do I have the money? Does that look right? As you start to bring people back and start to look at that. And then again, from a strategy standpoint, how do I look and do that? And from a customer perspective, what does that look like? All of those things become really important as you start to look at your business.
Yes, I couldn't agree with Robin. anymore. 100% right, especially on that well-being piece and what you're seeing various employers doing in terms of, gloves, masks, screens, all that kind of stuff. That is going to be the new currency going forward. And I talked earlier about competing for employees against kind of the supply chain, the delivery platforms and warehouses and grocery stores. That is going to be a point of competition too. And those employers that are taking those steps are going to be employers of choice, and those employers that are not going to be employers of choice. And one of the things that technology has done is revolutionized everything, but the level of employee education, information, engagement over the last 5 years has quadrupled, almost by the month it seems. And they know, employees know what the employers are that are taking care of people, who the ones that are trying to slide by and doing the minimum. And you're going to see that gulf even widen as a result of these new kind of worker safety provisions and what the new normal is.
Thank you for both those answers, Robin and Joe. It's funny, we started off so tactically on what's the CARES Act, what does it mean, who passed it, and you end in this very global well-being and wellness topic. And I'm so glad we arrived here, because that is what we're trying to do as human capital professionals, or just as people. I mean, I think that's what I'm doing in my neighborhood when I see my neighbors and I wave, making sure that there's a level of well-being that is satisfying. Because Joe, you're right. I mean, information is everywhere, and it takes me zero time to gather that feedback from others. So I appreciate you both ending on that, coming together on that point of well-being. I want to ask one additional question that came in from the listeners, and that's really what's happening to the global economy. So I think we just focused a little bit here just in the U.S. what's going on within our boundaries, but what happens? What the things that are happening here? This is rippling across the world, as is the coronavirus. Where are we set up with the global economy in 8 weeks, 10 weeks, that sort of thing?
I'm sure Robin's got a great answer for that.
I don't know if I have a great answer. I think, again, I'd kind of go back to what are some lessons and what are some things we're seeing coming out of China. And so, again, I think it's still early and we don't know, but I think there's some things that we should kind of look to from there. So here were just a couple of market trends that someone had shared with me from what they were seeing. If you look at things like makeup sales, no surprise, they declined during the virus. I mean, I think we all talked about getting ready for this presentation today, but again, this sort of work from home has a different look and feel to it than what maybe you would if you're kind of going out. But skincare went up. So people started, what are the things that you start to look at, kind of the health and the well-being kind of as one sort of thing. An interesting thing I thought is kind of from the housing perspective, what you started to see is, again, in China, more people kind of going for mortgages and buying homes. And I think that kind of lends itself to security. How do I start to have a place that's my own, that I can come to, that I can kind of be safe in and have control over? As I start to look at that, it was sort of another moment as that came out. So kind of how does that change? I think, does that change that suddenly we're going to have this dramatic surge in housing? I don't think so, because there's a whole financial component to it. But I do think that there's kind of not as intuitively to think about that. Talked a little bit about kind of from a restaurant perspective, what does that look like? And then again, I think this big thing that we saw, and as Jonah kind of have talked about, is that brands that care are those that are, and that were early to care, are the ones that people are sort of gravitating towards and starting to lead. So if you think about those kind of from an economic perspective, those are sort of where you might start to see some dollars and some shifts and some other things. There's a lot more things. Those are just like a few nuggets that were shared with me recently.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that in terms of the global piece. I obviously the markets, whether it's in Tokyo or London or New York, they're all skittish. There's a great deal of uncertainty. Two of the biggest economies in the world are having the biggest problem with this disease. That's got people on end. I think, one of the things that Asia and Europe tend to look at things a little differently than we do, obviously. And with regard just to how Asia and Europe approached this pandemic as it was rolling out, we could be very predictive of actions that our government was going to take, either it's federal, state, or local level, just by watching what Asia and Europe was doing 2 or 3 weeks earlier. And I was talking to our clients and saying, watch, it went from the actions of the French, German, and Italian governments. And I said to many business leaders here, that's coming our way. We need to prepare for that. And many very senior people were saying, that'll never happen here. And 4 days later, of course, it was happening here.
Right.
So it's just, watch telltale signs of how we can be predictive of that.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you.
I think one other just real quick thing. I think the other thing is kind of just this cross-industry. There's been cross-industry work in what's been happening, and Asia was again an example of something that happened. I don't think we've brought it to the U.S., and I don't know if this has made it to Europe yet. But a large grocer in Asia, when all this came, they went and said to a large restaurant group, we'll take 30,000 of your employees, we'll do their pay and benefits so that you can keep them employed. We're going to borrow them to help during this crisis. So if you think about it, how are sort of cross industries, are they starting to work together? Is that a new model? Is that something we'll see kind of coming? Again, there's different work rules and labor rules and all of those things that add some complexity to it. But I think if we think about human capital strategies that are going to survive and going to excel and going to, do really well, they're going to be creative and innovative, and they're going to start to think about sort of resilience and change and how do I move in a quick way and where do I create those partnerships and to be able to do that.
Yeah, important comments and thinking about cross-industry and employees and even transferable skills. I mean, there's huge impact there. So we're running down to the end of our time together. So first, Joe and Robin, thank you so much for your willingness to be a part of this and share your thoughts and do some research so that you were prepared and knew what to talk about here. I really appreciate that. I'd like to ask just from each of you just one takeaway so that our listeners can have a specific thing to do when they hang up. Like, what's that first thought that should cross their mind? So Joe, you got a takeaway for us?
Well, I'm going to cheat and do 2 takeaways. One's
Okay.
a short, easy one. As this process with these loan programs, evolves, the SBA website has been a tremendous resource in terms of identifying who are approved loaners in your community. So if people haven't already done that, they need to know who those lending institutions, big and small, are in their community to understand that space quickly. I would say the other piece, and Jason, you touched on this earlier, and we skipped around a little bit, but again, that the bipartisan nature of this particular piece of legislation we're talking about today, members of Congress, and I've been in this political world about 30 years now. It'd be hard. I'm insulted if I find anybody more cynical than I am. But I tell you, I have been amazed at the level of cooperation relative to what we usually see. And my point is that every member of Congress, whether they're from a rural district or a big city, whether it's red, blue, wherever it is, north, south, east, west, they all are incredibly invested in the success of these programs. The country really depends on it. And so they are very open and wanting input and reaction and counsel from small business leaders and community leaders and whoever can tell them what's working, what's not working. Hey, I had this problem. Small business administrator didn't seem to understand, or my bank won't help me. I know it's hard in the political world to get access to elected officials often, and they don't try to stay away from the public. This is not that time, and they are eager because they've got so much on the line, not only for the country but for themselves. And so now's the time. Don't be shy about reaching to your member of Congress, your senator, your House person, and saying, hey, we need more of this, we need less of that. This is what's working, this is not what's working. This is a better idea. They are And again, I know I sound kind of Pollyanna. They are all ears right now because they're on the hook for getting this right. So I would, if people hang up here, after this webinar, go understand your local lending institutions and don't be shy about weighing in with your electeds on how this is working and what they can be doing better, because for the first time in a long time, they're all ears.
Thank you. Robin?
Yeah, I would say, again, I'll go back to sort of this well-being, before you get hung up on, there's so much coming at you. I mean, as an HR professional, it is exhausting right now. There's so many changes, things are happening, the responsibility you have for your employees. But if you haven't, make sure you've checked sort of, how are you checking the health and well-being of your employees, and making sure that, so that can kind of play into it. And then I think to Joe's point, I'd say, make sure you understand all of the nuances of the legislation and where it benefits you. Also understand where it may hinder or not enable you to execute on your strategy. And then if it's not helping you, I think to Joe's point, go ahead and give that and provide that feedback, but don't let those things sort of control what you need to do from a business perspective.
Great. Thank you, Robin. And again, Joe and Robin, thank you for being on here. Brianna, I'll send it back to you. Thank you for enabling this conversation. I really appreciate it, and I made a ton of notes and had a great time. So thanks very much.
Yeah, ditto. Thanks to all of you. I was taking notes personally for myself. I was learning a ton from each of you. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everyone who joined us and stuck through us the whole hour. I hope to see you back for our next one. Bye, everyone.
Bye.